Hey, so um, the readings for this week are focusing on how to do philosophy. Now, I'm going to take it that most folks haven't taken a look at much philosophy, perhaps outside of critical thinking. And so this week, what I want us to focus on is how we do philosophy. So, what we're focusing on today is this one technique called thought experiments. And what we're going to focus on in the rest of this week, we're going to take a look at the way in which science interacts with philosophy, and then the way in which our ordinary experiences interact with philosophy. Right? So that's coming down the line. Today we're thinking about thought experiments. So what exactly is a thought experiment? Well, from the readings that you've done, plus the examples that you saw, that one IO9 article, and with the clips that you watched from Dan Dennett, the idea behind a thought experiment is that we create some scenario, and then this scenario is supposed to pump our intuitions about what is or isn't the case. So one of the ones from the IO9 website that you read was about Mary, the colorblind neuroscientist. Right. So the thought experiment goes like this, as you'll recall from your reading. That Mary is a neuroscientist. She knows everything there is to know about the visual system. But she has grown up in a black and white laboratory. So imagine one day that Mary steps outside of her laboratory, and for the first time in her life, she sees a big, ripe, red tomato. So when this happens, does Mary learn anything new? So this thought experiment was originally proposed by this philosopher Frank Jackson, and Jackson took away from this that Mary does in fact learn something new, right? She knew everything involved with rods and cones and with primary visual cortex and all that sort of stuff. But the one thing she didn't know was what it looked like, or what a ripe red tomato looked like, right? What's called the qualia of looking at a red, ripe tomato. So Jackson looks at this and goes, clearly Mary learned something new. She learned what it looks like, or what it feels like to see a ripe red tomato. So what's characteristic of a thought experiment is that we describe some scenario, and this scenario is supposed to imply something about a philosophical topic. Now, in Brown's paper, he describes three different kinds of thought experiments, right? He talks about destructive thought experiments, so that one I just gave with Mary, right? That's a destructive thought experiment. A conclusive thought experiment, and a conjectural thought experiment. Now, in philosophy, we tend to focus on destructive and conjectural thought experiments. And the reason is because I take it that what philosophical thought experiments show us is that something that we thought was necessary, or what had to be true, didn't necessarily have to be true after all. Right? So, in the case of Mary the neuroscientist, what we thought had to be true, that if you know everything there is to know about how the brain works, then you'll also know what it's like to have certain visual experiences. But what Jackson's thought experiment does for us is it shows that that's not necessarily the case. So, when we're reading any thought experiment, two questions to keep in mind. The first is, what is this thought experiment supposed to show? Now, in the case of Mary the neuroscientist, what it's supposed to show is that knowledge of what something is like is not exhausted by our knowledge of facts about perception, right? So knowing everything there is to know about how brain works, how the physics of light works, all of that stuff, right? Knowing all of those things isn't going to tell you what it's like to see a red tomato, right? So the first question to ask is, what does this thought experiment show us? The second question to ask is, how does the thought experiment do this? Now, that gets to be a little trickier, because what a thought experiment relies on is it relies on details in the telling of the thought experiment, right? So we set up the thought experiment, and we provide enough detail to make it obvious what it is that it's supposed to show. Right? And that's sort of the key move for any thought experiment, is that it's supposed to be obvious for us what it's supposed to show. So, as you're listening, or rather, as you're reading through some of those examples of thought experiments, the 9 thought experiments that, whatever, won't let you sleep at night or whatever they do, ask yourself, what is this thought experiment supposed to show us, and how does it do that? And so what I would encourage you to do is that on the discussion board, for any one of those, I started picking on the trolley one because that's a really fun one to think about. Anyway, on the discussion boards, start asking these 2 questions, right? Well, what does this thought experiment show us? How does it do this? Because once we identify those things, we can, as Dennett says, we can start fiddling with the knobs, right? So, for example, here's actually one of Dennett's knob fiddlings with Mary the Neuroscientist, right? He says, suppose that instead of Mary seeing a big ripe red tomato, imagine she sees an electric blue banana, right? So then, what does that do for our intuitions, right? Do we imagine Mary walking out and going, and saying, oh my gosh, I never knew what it was like to see a bright blue banana? Or is she just like, oh, bright blue banana, right? What do you think Mary would say if, upon leaving her black and white lab, she sees a bright blue banana instead of a ripe red tomato? And so, key to thought experiments in philosophy is learning how to fiddle with the knobs, right? Because it's then that we can figure out what they're doing and and how they're doing it. And thought experiments, as we're going to see throughout our summer session here, thought experiments are key in philosophy. They serve an important role in helping move philosophical argument forward. And what I hope to do is have you begin to think critically about thought experiments, because some of them are sort of hogwash and crap, but also having you start developing your own thought experiments. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or I suppose you can call me on my office extension. But yeah, and I look forward to chatting with you on the discussion boards on Blackboard.